Good morning, everyone. Yeah, if you can get that light. I hope you had a good night's sleep and weren't kept up all night trying to figure out Daniel chapter 9. I've been up since 3, looking at things and answering questions, and so if I fall asleep, it's better that I do than you do. So I want to go back and look at and start over on Matthew 24 and just review a little bit. You have the outline in front of you on the Olivet Discourse, and I've suggested that what Jesus does in the first 28 verses is give us an outline of this thing called the tribulation, or Jacob's trouble, or the wrath of God, and that he outlines the beginning of the tribulation, the middle, and the end. And that time period is 7 years, and in a moment we're going to look at the passage that starts us thinking about it being 7 years. But the book of Revelation verifies this, and it uses numbers that indicate 3.5. In some verses it says this happens for 3.5 years, or 2,690 days, or whatever, however you slice it, it's 3.5 years, and that there seems to be 2 of these 3.5 years, which equals 7. So that's why we say the tribulation is 7. So at any rate, we're on the Mount, and in verses 4 through 14, Jesus talks about false messiahs, and last night we were flipping back and forth to Revelation, which made it so we didn't look at all the detail of Matthew itself, and so I'm going to assume that you have this chart by you to see which seal in Revelation it's talking about, but I don't want to get distracted too much on what Revelation is saying, and we want to kind of stick to Matthew 24. And so the first birth pang is the danger of false Christs. That's how. Now remember, the audience is, yes, it's the disciples. He's answering the questions, but he's telling them about the people of that time, how they're going to be able to tell when his coming is about ready to come. And one of the signs is that there's going to be many claiming to be Christ, to mislead many, because the times will be so difficult that people will be looking for somebody to answer their need. And the Jews have always had an expectation of a Messiah. In fact, if you go over to Israel, there's a picture of a guy that they say is the Messiah, and they are looking for him to bind them together, and he hasn't done anything yet, but there's always somebody that people put their hopes in. And isn't that the way it is even today, with all the economic troubles, the pandemic? There were people that were looking for somebody to make sense of this and to tell us what to do, and by golly, we listened to what they told us to do. Can you imagine if things were even worse and then somebody rose to the top? And that's what this is saying, is that it is in this first part of the tribulation that the Antichrist ascends to recognition. At first there's a lot of them vying for this position, but then somebody rises to the top, and Revelation describes him as coming in on a white horse with no bow, with no arrows, that he's coming in peace. And so you remember in Thessalonians it says, when they say peace, peace, then you should worry. And so that's the beginning sign, but it doesn't last for long. In fact, I tend to think that it only lasts for the first year. And by the way, if you did have a whole year of peace in this world, that would be pretty amazing. We've never had a year anywhere in the world where there hasn't been some war going on, and yet there will seem to be this false peace. But then suddenly, verses 6 and 7, you'll be hearing of the wars and rumors of wars, but don't be frightened yet. It's still not quite the end. And I think in context of prophecy, that's referring to the immediate area of Israel, but wars in the whole world, but especially in that area. And if you're familiar with the book of Daniel, Daniel 11 talks about how there's all kinds of unrest in the south and in the north, and that there's kind of a pincher movement going on to control Israel, and there's this period where nobody knows quite what's going on, and it's a frightening time. And buttressed by Revelation 6 and the red horse, which is war, there's not only Daniel 11 that talks about the unrest of wars, there's Zechariah says a similar thing. And wherever there's war, there's a shortage of food and money, and a famine will begin. Earthquakes will start happening. These are all part of the slow birth pangs of the coming kingdom. The famines lead to pestilence and death in the fourth seal, and then we left off kind of last night with the martyrdom and apostasy. That is going to happen, verses 9 through 13. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. And at that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and mislead many, because lawlessness is increased. Most people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. So again, he's speaking about largely what's going on in the Jewish realm. And it seems like even though they have not accepted Christ as a whole, there will be a resurgence of belief or following of the Jewish faith in the end days. There will be a rekindling of it. And I think we see it even now. There are still more atheistic Jews than there are Orthodox Jews, but there's a constant coming back home to Judaism. And anti-Semitism is going to rise. It's already on the rise now. It's never really shrunk, and it will get so bad during this time that they will deliver you. They'll have you arrested. They just can't stand having you around as Jewish people, but also as anyone who expresses faith. Lawlessness is increased. Is there any doubt but that lawlessness is increasing now? I'm not saying this is the tribulation, but look what's happening. Everything's getting turned upside down. The criminal has more rights than the innocent citizen. There's a defense of aberrant behavior more than the straight and narrow. And it's going to get worse than that as time goes on. But we suggested that it is during this period, the first half of the tribulation, that the gospel finally goes to the ends of the earth. And if you follow the chronology of Revelation, the seals are saying the same thing. And then there's, before the trumpet judgments start, there's Revelation 7 that talks about the 144,000, and it tells us what they're doing and how they're going to be protected from death. And can you imagine being able to witness in the face of enemies and not worry about getting killed for it? And so they're going to get the word across. And so before things get really, 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 really bad, the whole world has heard the gospel. In fact, we believe that more people are going to be saved during that 7-year period than through any other 7-year period, but especially there's an extreme reception of the gospel at that time. So instead of looking at the tribulation as, God's just killing everybody, no, He's saving more people than ever during that time. And in connection with Matthew 24 verse 14. We suggested that the sixth seal corresponds to that, Revelation 6:12 through 17, and I do want to look at Revelation 6 for a moment, because one of the questions last night, a good question that wasn't verbalized, but I'll see if I can answer it because of the language of Revelation 6:13 to 14. 6:14 through 15 says this: "The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, and the great ones, and the generals, and the rich, and the powerful, and everyone enslaved and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, 'Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who's seated on the throne, from the wrath of the Lamb.'" Which, by the way, that phrase indicates that what has been happening is called the wrath of the Lamb, the sealed judgments. The ramifications of that are, if the sealed judgments are in the first half of the tribulation, they are described as the wrath of God. The mid-tribulation, the mid-rapture position believes that the wrath of God doesn't start until the middle of the tribulation. And so that's why they say Christians are going to go through the first half, but then the wrath of God doesn't really start till later. But that verse tells us that what's been going on is the wrath of God, just as an aside. But the question was, if the mountains are removed and the sky vanishes, how can the kings hide in the mountains? That's a good question, right? Well, the word removed, this is where you need to consult other translations. The word removed just means to cause to move, and the New American Standard just renders it moves instead of removes like the ESV. And so it doesn't connote a disappearing, but a removing. Don't think of it as removed, disappearing, but it's moved. It's displaced, and like an earthquake, the mountain moves, and the same with the sky vanishing. The New American Standard says split apart, that there's some sort of atmospheric, sort of like going up in a plane and your ears pop and so forth. It just is referring to a change, not a ceasing to exist. And so what do the kings of the earth do when they see all this stuff happening? They still rely on the mountains that just moved. What a foolish thing to do. Instead of submitting to God, they put their trust in the environment, which isn't that what people are doing? Why is it we're so intent on saving the earth? Because they believe that's the only thing there is. And so there's still, and that's the purpose of the judgments on the earth during the tribulation, is to kick the props out from underneath people, because they worship the earth. And so the trees are going to be diminished, the water is going to be contaminated. All the things that they're trying not to do are going to happen. But it's God's going to do it, and we're not going to stop it. So anyway, that's just a little explanation of what's going on in those verses. And so then, after we reach now the middle of the tribulation, and that's where verse 15 comes in. And I had you read Daniel 9, and so let's turn there now, Daniel chapter 9. And you'll recall that we went through the first half of Daniel bits by pieces, going over the dreams that they had. Now, God has distinguished Daniel as a wise counselor who can interpret dreams, and now God gives him a vision. Chapter 9 and verse 1, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, who was made king over the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So the first year of Darius is like 539 BC. So that's when he has this vision to give us some time context. But this prophecy that we're about ready to read in verse 24, in 1642, a genius boy, Sir Isaac Newton, who was known for all kinds of discoveries, but that if he had died at the age of 26, he still would have gone down as one of the greatest scientists of all time because of his laws of motion. But then he discovered many more things. But he also was an astute student of scriptures. And in studying this passage, he applied his scientific brain to this passage, and he said, you can stake all Christianity on this prophecy alone. He said, about the time of the end, a body of men will be raised up who will turn their attention to the prophecies and insist upon their literal interpretation in the midst of much clamor and opposition. That was written in 1642, or the 1600s. And so let's just read 24 through 27. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, atone for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint the most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks, and then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in troubled times. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war, desolations are decreed. And he, that is the prince who is to come, shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. So 70 weeks are given to Daniel before God is done dealing with Israel. And by the way, if you want, for the sake of curiosity, 2 Chronicles chapter 36 tells us why Israel had to go into captivity for 70 years. Verse 20. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths all the days that it laid unused. In other words, for 490 years, Israel did not celebrate the Sabbath. So when you divide 490 by 7, because the Sabbath is every 7 years, the land was gypped of 70 years' worth of rest. So that's why they were taken away for 70 years, because they broke the Sabbath. And so Daniel's reading Jeremiah about this, and he's saying, oh man, it's all over, we're going to go back. And God says, yeah, they're going to go back, but I'm not done with the transgressions of Israel. There are 70 more weeks of something that are that need to happen. And so it says 70 weeks, and in Hebrew the word weeks is it's a word like our dozen. It could be a dozen of this or a dozen of that. You could say, I'm going away for a dozen days or a dozen weeks or a dozen months or a dozen years, right? Context has to determine. Whatever these weeks are, it indicates that Messiah or the Anointed One is going to be present at that point. And so if this is 539 BC, was Jesus present 483 days later? Obviously not. Or 483 weeks or months? No, but he was definitely here 483 years later. Somewhere do you have that chart of the breakdown of it has Palm Sunday on, yeah. The other one not like that one. We'll come back to that one. This should be another one on there. Yeah, no, not the Julian. It's on the other list. Right, fourth one down. Okay, so 69 weeks. So we got 7 weeks, and then 62 comes to 69, right? Times 7 equals 483 years. We need to understand that the Jews thought in the concept that each month only has 30 days, not 31 sometimes and 30 the others and 28. Our calendar today, the Julian calendar, has more days in it than the Jewish calendar. So you have to understand they were thinking about the Jewish calendar. That's the context, which only had 30 days in it. So 483 years times 360 is 173,880 days. Most likely, it says that from the decree to restore the city, there would be 69 weeks. The Encyclopedia Britannica tells us that Xerxes' decree was made in the year 444, and literally on March 5th, 444 BC, which if you do the math, it comes out to March 30th, AD 33, which was Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday was the day that the Jewish people chose the lamb that they were going to sacrifice at the end of the week. So that lamb was then tested for 4 days. They picked it on Sunday, picked the lamb without blemish, and then they watched it for 4 days and tested it to make sure it was pure. And it was during that week that Jesus was tried before Pilate. He was tried before the Sanhedrin, and Pilate said, "This man is innocent." The exact day of Christ's presentation, this is why we call it the triumphal entry, is he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, which was a prophecy that the next Messiah is going to come in peace on a donkey. And so he purposely had his men find a donkey. You remember that story? And then he purposely rode into Jerusalem, and the people were about ready to celebrate Passover, and Palm Sunday was the beginning of it, and they were singing songs during that time of the year, just like we sing songs during Christmas and Easter. They had a set of songs called the Hallel Psalms, which talked about, "This is the day that the Lord has made." And they were singing those songs, and they sang Hallelujah. And that's why they laid palm branches before him, because this was the day that the Lord had made. And it was predicted in Daniel chapter 9 to occur on that day. And then, so the Anointed One would be here, and but then in verse 26, you have to underline the word after. And after the 62 weeks, an Anointed One shall be cut off, shall have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come. So who are the people who are to come from what we were studying last night? Now remember the 4 kingdoms? Rome. They aren't here yet, so he's prophesying. He's saying the people of the prince who is to come are going to destroy the city and the sanctuary. And so that happened in 70 AD. But what I want you to note is verse 26 says, after the 62 weeks. It doesn't say during the 70th. It says after the 62, the anointed one's going to be cut off, which is a word for killed. And the people of the prince who is to come are going to destroy the city or the sanctuary. So I want you to realize that everybody agrees that Jesus died 30 to 33 AD. And everybody agrees that the temple was destroyed in 70. So there's 40 years of time. What I'm advocating or suggesting to you is that there is a gap of time in between the 69th week and the beginning of the 70th. And I say this because almost all interpreters agree with what I was saying up to this point. Even the amillennialist that doesn't believe there's going to be a millennium says that this is describing when Jesus presented himself. They agree that Palm Sunday was that day. What they don't agree with is that there's a gap of time in between the 69th and the 70th week. And they believe that the 70th week just happened right after that. You follow me? So, in other words, the prophecy's over with. But there are several evidences of gaps in prophecy. For instance, in Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 9 and 10, that's the prophecy of the Messiah coming in on a donkey, and then he's going to rule. But he didn't rule, did he? There's a gap of time. He presented himself, but then in the white spaces, something happened, and he doesn't become the accepted king until later. In other words, the first and the second coming are often put together, but there's a space of time between them. It's sort of like looking at a mountain peak from a distance. It looks like it's one right on top of the other, but when you travel and get closer to them, there's miles in between them. But the perspective is they're putting those two prophecies together. And so that's very common in Scripture. Zechariah is one case. When Jesus stood up in the temple and read from Isaiah, he read about how he's come to heal the sick and to die and to restore people. And then he closed the book. But the next verse said that he rules with a rod of iron and he's going to be king. So that's not unusual if you're honest with prophecy. And so what I'm suggesting and what many of us suggest is that the first 7 weeks of the prophecy had to do with restoring the outside of the city, and then the 62 leads up to the Messiah being present. But they are contiguous, and so we refer to them as the 69. There's no gap between those, but there's a gap here between these. And I just wanted to go back for a moment about the prince who's going to destroy the sanctuary. That was Vespasius. Vespasius gave Israel to his son Titus, and Titus took 100,000 men and went to Jerusalem, and he built a mound around the wall so they couldn't get out. And they nailed 500 Jews on crosses every day until the wood around Jerusalem was denuded. There were no more trees. The stench was unbearable. 1 million died of starvation, and they just threw their bodies over the walls to get rid of the stench. The people had to eat their belts and shoes and hay and rats, and even mothers started eating dead people so that their kids could survive. That was how bad it was. And yet, the prophecies we're going to see in a moment tell us that what is to come has never been experienced in the history of Judaism or the world. That was bad, but that was only 1 million. When Hitler came, 6 million were killed. And I can't even begin to relate to you some of the atrocities that happened just 80 years ago in our time. And it was 10 times worse than 70 AD. And yet Christ didn't come right then either. He's still not here. So it tells us there is still coming a time that is even worse than that. And so one of the reasons why we don't believe this, that we believe there's still prophecy to come, is that Jesus hasn't returned yet, right? When we look at the Mount of Olives, it says that the Mount of Olives is going to be split when Jesus returns. It's not split. Some of us have been there. And so this is still future. And so when going back to Daniel, after the 62 weeks, Messiah's cut off, the city's destroyed, but then there's still something else coming. Verse 27 says that he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. What's a week? 7 years. And for half of the week, he's going to put an end to the sacrifice and offering. So the people of the prince to come destroy the city. That's Rome. But the prince to come is not Jesus, it's the Antichrist. The word prince is used for both Messiah and for the Antichrist. That's Antichrist, Christ. Prince. And this prince, who's going to be the recognized ruler of the revived Roman Empire, is going to make a strong covenant with the many for 1 week. And the many is the Jewish people. But halfway through the week, he's going to commit the abomination of desolation, or on the wing of an abomination, he's going to come and make desolate, which Revelation 13 tells us about the same event. Says he's going to make himself as God and set himself up in the temple. He's going to proclaim himself to be God on the very spot that God reserves for himself. Now that's a stinking thing. Abomination means something that stinks. It's a repulsion. It's something that even secular Jews today would have a fit about. You know, they tell you they don't care, there's no God, but you start desecrating their history, and I bet you they'd rise up in rebellion. And like I said, in the end days, the Jewish people are going to have a heightened sense of their Judaism, even before they accept Christ. And so, going back to Matthew 24:15, Jesus is saying, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, he's talking about this passage, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. You better listen up, he's saying. Now, by Jesus saying that the abomination of desolation hasn't happened yet, that's telling us that it wasn't Antiochus Epiphanes 200 years before. There was a desecration of the temple by a pig, in the book of Maccabees. The Romans came in the Greeks. This was the Greeks, not the Romans. That's another reason why that's not a fulfillment of the prophecy. They butchered a pig on the altar, which was an abomination. And it was restored and so forth, but Christ didn't come. Christ is here now, 200 years later, and he's saying that this prophecy is still future. So, that tells us something. And remember, we said that the book of Revelation has the same chronology, and that was written in 90 AD, after the destruction of the temple. So, he says, let the reader understand. In fact, let's look at Revelation 13 for a minute. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns, 7 heads, 10 diadems on his horns, blasphemous names on his head. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, and his feet like a bear's mouth was like a lion's mouth. Does that sound familiar? All those animals in Daniel? In other words, the beast is a composite of all the past vast kingdoms together under the power of Rome, and one of its heads seems to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast, and they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast, and who can fight against him? And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. How long is that? 3.5 years. So the point is, in the middle of the tribulation, 3.5 years, he commits the abomination of desolation, which, as the verse goes on, he opened his mouth and uttered blasphemies and was allowed to make war on the saints. So he's going to be recognized as the power of the world for 42 months or for the rest of the tribulation. That's why we say it's a 7-year period. It's called so many days, so many months, and this is Daniel's 70th week. The implication is that this guy, I'm not convinced he's actually killed, but it seems to me there's an assassination attempt that everybody thinks he's killed, and then he miraculously comes back and is able to gain people's confidence. And there's even a passage in Thessalonians about an image that comes alive. And I just can't help but think of artificial intelligence that's going on. You just watch the news any day in the past couple of weeks. Oh, artificial intelligence, and they can. You've heard of these people that take a snippet of your voice on your cell phone and make a conversation out of it, and then call your parents and say that we've got your daughter and we're going to kill her if you don't send us $1 million. People are being scammed all over the place because they have the ability today to create untruth and make it seem like truth. So it's no surprise to me that there's going to be something that's just going to dupe everybody. It's not that far off, people. If we can do it today, just think what 10 years is going to do. So that's why we had a question last night. How do we know that the abomination of desolation is in the middle of the 7 weeks? Does that make sense now? Can you see how it's in the middle of the week? And that's why, going back to Matthew 24, I believe Jesus is giving us an outline of the 7 years. The first 14 verses are the first 3.5 years, and then there's the abomination of desolation. And then from this point on, in verses 16 and following, we now passed over into the second half of the tribulation. At 6:30 on the evening of April 20th, is today the 21st? Well, on the 20th was, in 1889 was Hitler's birthday. And he grew up with a great ambition. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, where he was rejected, and many believe it was a Jewish professor that rejected him. And that's part of where he gained his hatred. But after World War I, the German Empire was in unrest. They'd lost the war. They were poor. And they were looking for a way to get back into ascendancy. The nation was in great debt. People couldn't pay their mortgages. There were 6 million unemployed in a day when there weren't that many millions. Hindenburg was convinced that the only way to save Germany was to appoint Hitler as a chancellor because he had something about him, in that he hated communism on the one hand, and so they believed he was going to create an economic system for them that would work, and so they suspended the Weimar Constitution, which guaranteed individual liberty to people for 4 years. They suspended the Constitution and gave Hitler absolute power, in which he then created laws in the Parliament in which would rectify their problem, and people were so desperate for a solution that they let him do whatever he wanted, and he made certain people illegal, handicapped, mentally challenged people, and Jews. Jews couldn't work as doctors, musicians, or in the fine arts, and many of them began to leave the country, of course, and the ones who didn't leave eventually were brought to concentration camps. But when they use the phrase the final solution, meaning the gas chambers for the Jews, the reason it's called the final solution is because you know what the first solution was? It had already gotten to the point that the way Hitler was getting rid of the Jews was that he sent in his army, and they would capture whole towns, and they would kill one individual at a time, shooting them, bury the one, shoot the next one, bury them while everybody's watching. They did this for months and years, and they did it one at a time to impress upon, to cause fear in the people. But it got so expensive for bullets that his solution was, I can't afford for you to shoot them anymore. I need the bullets on the front line because we're fighting a war. So let's put them in the gas chambers. It was actually more horrible what they were doing before. This is just 80 years ago. And Hitler's main point in his writing that he made when he was put in prison for a short time was tell a lie and tell it big, because people forget. I mean, I see this every day on the news, how forgetful we are. Things that were on the news every day for a week, a year later, it's still happening, but you don't hear about it anymore. They take the spotlight off, and we forget. And pretty soon there aren't going to be any people living who went through the Holocaust that can challenge teachers who say, this really didn't happen like that. It scares me, the ability we have to forget. But the Jews know better, and they don't forget. And that's why after the war, when they had a chance, by the mercy of God, to have a spot that they could defend, they aren't going to trust anybody anymore, not even America. And that's why this prophecy of Daniel, when it says that the prince who is to come is going to make a covenant with them, it's so unbelievable because they don't trust anybody right now. So something's got to happen. Something in this world's got to snap to make it so that they will trust this charismatic guy. Like Hitler. Hitler was loved. The people loved him. And I'm telling you, there's coming somebody like that that's going to dupe the leaders of Israel. But that assumes that they are back in the land, right? Well, until 1948, they weren't back in the land. And so something's happening. You can't tell me that something isn't happening. This Israel is the only nation in history that lived so many thousand years ago and is still around today in the exact land that they started out in. No other people group can claim that. You can't tell me that there's not a prophecy going through here. And so in the second half of the tribulation, starting in verse 16, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever's on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are out in their house. Whoever's in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those nursing babies in those days. Pray that your flight not be in winter or on the Sabbath. And again, if you've been in Israel, they don't have snow like we do, and so they have flat roofs. And it serves as a patio, and people spend a lot of time up there. That's what got David in trouble looking down into the city. He's saying, if you're up on the roof, don't go down and pick up your pocketbook. Jump off the roof when you see this abomination of desolation. See, the Jews have heard about it. They heard about it in Daniel, right? They don't listen to us in the New Testament right now, but like I said yesterday, Organizations like Friends of Israel and Chosen People are sending Bibles to synagogues, New Testaments, so that when we disappear, it will arrive on their doorstep, so that priests who are known for studying will start opening the Word and see the same phraseology that was used in Daniel, and they know what Daniel was talking about, and they have an expectation for the Messiah to return, just like we do. And then they connect the dots of Matthew, and massive salvation and conversion is going to take place. But they're the ones that this warning is given to. When you see this happen, get out of the house. If you're out in the field, don't go back to get your purse. Run. Because now the birth pangs, remember the birth pangs start out slow in the first 3.5 years, but then when the abomination of desolation comes, they're going to get quicker and quicker, and the trumpet judgments start hitting that are more intense until we get to the bowls, until finally the birth of the new kingdom comes when Christ arrives. Matthew doesn't give us all the details of the trumpets and bowls. That's why you need to study Revelation. But that's what's being described here. They're to flee to the mountains. Revelation 12 tells us that at this moment, it's at this point in the middle of the tribulation that Satan is cast out of heaven. You know that? He's still there. Satan still can go before. He can get so close to God in the sense that he goes and accuses the brethren. He has access as a fallen angel to go and accuse us. But at this point, he's cast out once and for all to the earth. And when he gets on the earth, he goes after the woman who birthed the child. He goes after Israel. And she has to flee. She goes to the mountains. Some people suggest that she goes to Petra. Petra is in Edom. That back in the book of Daniel, when the armies from the north were coming after Israel, they bypassed Edom because it's so deserty. They didn't figure anybody could live there. So it's possible that a great majority of Jews from the city go to this place, which is a desert hole with no resources, but maybe God is going to supply for them like he did Elijah when he fed by the ravens and so forth. Or it could mean that they get swallowed up by humanity, like what happened during World War II when Gentiles took in Jews. And so maybe a combination of both. We're not sure, but somehow the Antichrist bypasses them, or they are able to hide for a period of time. Verse 21 of chapter 24, Matthew 24. Then there will be a great tribulation. Now I want you to notice back in the first passage when we were talking about the beginning of the week, that also is called tribulation, but the second half is called the Great Tribulation because things start really multiplying. And unless those days are cut short, everyone would have been extinguished. Now, there's some confusion on this verse. Some people like to say, oh, God stopped the tribulation short, but I don't think that's what it means. I think the very fact that it's only 3.5 years is the cutting short. If it was any longer, everyone would have been exterminated. No life would have been saved. Verse 23 of chapter 24. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, don't believe him. I mean, things are going to be so confusing. Because false Christs and prophets are going to arise, and they're going to show signs and wonders so as to mislead. And by the way, Satan can use people to do miracles. Just because a miracle happens, don't automatically assume it's of God. Behold, I've told you this in advance. So if they say to you, behold, Christ is in the wilderness, don't go out, he says. Or, he's in an inner room and he wants to meet you. It's a trap. There's going to be such a desperation that everybody, and it happens in our age too. everybody looks for somebody who's going to help them, and they're going to have the solution. And so, I mean, I see it even in Christian circles. Oh, did you hear? There's a cure for this over here. If you just go and you invest in this thing, you're not going to have cancer anymore. And we're all looking for an answer. And what he's saying is times are going to be so confusing that false teachers are going to rise up to catch you. And they're working for the Antichrist. They whisper and say, hey, if you really believe the Messiah is coming, I think I know where he is. Come on. Let's see him. And then they capture you. And Revelation tells us that many of them get beheaded and stuff. And so he's saying, don't trust anybody. Why? Because, verse 27, for just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so is the coming of the Son of Man. In other words, when Jesus does return, you're going to know it. Everybody's going to know it. It's not going to be a secret. Like the lightning is seen by everybody at the same time. Or where the corpse is, where the vultures gather. In other words, when you see vultures, you know that the corpse is right there. It's clear. It'll be clear to everybody. I used to work on a dairy farm, and every spring we had so many cows that we had a baby calf born every day. But the dry cows were out in the pasture, and you had to go searching for the calf, because if you didn't find it, the coyotes were going to get it, or it would be born dead or something. And so we figured out the way to find out where there was a baby calf, whether it was dead or alive. The vultures are right there. They see it, so you just go where the vultures are. The point is, when he comes, you're going to know it. Does that make sense? So that brings us to the great event of the second coming itself, and in chapter 24 and verse 29. So if the first 14 verses are the beginning of the tribulation, verse 15 is the middle of the tribulation, 16 through 28 is the second half of the tribulation. Verse 29 says, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Immediately. This is a sign word, and it means immediately, not 20 days later, not 5 years later. But at the conclusion of this time that's being cut short. In fact, I want to throw in here Hebrews 9:28 for your consideration. It says, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those waiting for him. His arrival is called the second coming. This is the second coming. So immediately after the tribulation, the sun goes dark, the moon won't give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And so here is, and I've advocated that this is not the rapture, this is his actual return to the earth, in which he begins to set up his kingdom. Which, by the way, there's a theology called preterism, which means everything's happened in the past, that believes that all these prophecies happened by 70 AD. But if they did, where is Christ? Now, if they said, well, there's a gap of time, which they don't believe in gaps of time. If there's a gap of time, then maybe we could tolerate the view. But this says immediately, and they contradict their own theology if they say there is a gap of time here, because they don't accept it in Daniel 9, but they will accept it here. But where's Jesus? There's no historical evidence that he returned, or we would not be sitting here today. We would be walking around in glory under his rule. In fact, the early church did not believe 70 AD was a fulfillment of this. The early church for the first 400 years believed in premillennialism, like I'm saying. They didn't have all the nuances worked out. They probably weren't clear on the role of Israel, at least some of them, but there is evidence that some of them were. The Didache, which was written in the second century, takes this passage and looks forward to the return of Christ, and it hasn't happened yet. So church history tells us that Christ did not return. The first sign here is a worldwide blackout. The sun is darkened. This corresponds to Joel, the minor prophet, chapter 3, that says the same thing, that God is going to change, He's going to disturb the planet to let you know that He is here. They will feel like the sky is falling. And if you compare those passages, it's talking about the same thing. And then verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn. All of them, all will see. Remember when we talked about the rapture, it's not right to say secret rapture. It's just that the rapture happens so fast, nobody sees it. It's not a secret. But the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and everyone always asks, what's the sign? Well, Jesus is the sign. And interestingly enough, Dr. Showers, who's now gone to be with the Lord, he was one of my professors, he suggests that the sign is Christ appearing as if He's coming out of a tomb in the sky with His scars showing. That's the actual sign that all the tribes see, and they mourn because they realize how wrong they've been. And some of them will cry, I'm not ready. Acts 1:9-11, Jesus said goodbye to the disciples, and He ascends from where? The Mount of Olives, the Mount of Ascension. He rises, and the angel said, don't fear. He's going to come back in the same way. And then Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 6. I didn't intend to turn there, but Zechariah 14:6. It says, on that day, verse 4, on that day His feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lie before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall be moved north and the other south. And you shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Hazel, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah. And then the Lord my God will come, and all His holy ones with Him. And on that day there will be no light, cold, or frost, and there will be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening there shall be light. And at any rate, this is a fulfillment of His coming to. When He comes at that moment, it's because Jerusalem is surrounded by the armies of Armageddon. The Valley of Armageddon is only about 80 to 100 miles north of Jerusalem, and they come right down the valley, and they surround the city, and they're about ready to exterminate it. And it is at that point that the Jewish people as a whole cry and say, we repent. And then Christ returns and saves them. And they will look on Him whom they pierced, and they will mourn because they know that they were wrong. And He gathers all those who are believers to Himself. But the context is He gathers them on the earth, not in the sky. He gathers them to show His rescue from every corner of the earth. Any clarifying questions up to this point? And then we'll take a break for a minute. Yes.
So some people will just be stubborn and not take the mark, but not be saved yet, but maybe come saved after.
Right. I mean, there's woodchucks around here like that they're not Christians, but you would swear they were by their beliefs, minus the curses. You know, they don't like what's going on any more than we do, but they won't accept Christ yet either. You know, so, yes.
So the term elect, here in verse 31 in Matthew 24, when he says he gathers his elect, it sounds very similar to the rapture, but I've also heard the term elect referred to for the Jewish remnant that's coming to Christ. Where else do we see like that term in Scripture?
Well, elect is a term used for any believer, where the elect of the church are called the church, but elect just means those who are chosen. Israel is chosen, but it's used for individual salvation as well, without distinguishing it as the church. And so these are the elect that are being gathered here are not only Jews, but Gentiles that have turned to Christ, but they're not technically the church if we have a right understanding that the church is gone. So the church is called elect, Israel is called elect, any believers called that.
Anyone else question before we take a break? If you're not comfortable asking publicly like this, please feel free. There's a white sheet that's on your table. Just write out the question. If you're not comfortable, presenting it, or you're not sure how well formed if you don't feel comfortable with that, write it down, and I'll take it up and make sure that it gets answered. So let's head off to break. And remember, there's coffee, there's pastries, all kinds of goodies, and we'll see you back here in 10 minutes, Lou. We'll see you back here in 10 minutes.